Okay, thank you, Rodney, for that very interesting and new take on creativity, which we can discuss at the end. Because I'd now like to warmly welcome our next speaker, Dr. Charles Forceville, who studied English language and literature at Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam, where he subsequently lectured in the departments of English, comparative literature, and word and image. He did a postdoc on narration in fiction and film at the Universiteit Leiden, and from the late 1990s he worked in the Department of Media Studies of the Universiteit van Amsterdam, where he also directs the department's research master's program. His publications include Pictorial Metaphor in Advertising and the forthcoming volume Multimodal Metaphor. His teaching and research are inspired by cognitivist-oriented models in linguistics and film, focusing on the structure and rhetoric of multimodal discourse in various medias and genres. He will now present on the generation of creativity, adapting blending theory to shed some light on the elusive nature of creativity in the frame of popular discourse. I now welcome Charles to the podium.
First of all, I'd like to say that I'm honored and it's a great pleasure to have been invited to Hong Kong. And of course, I'd like to thank the entire organization, but I'll thank them in the three people that I've had most interaction with: Rodney Jones, Bellu Wong, and Jason, who nicely showed me around on Sunday and who introduced me to the pleasures of a dim sum breakfast. Okay, I should say that I think that one of the core businesses of being of scholarship is actually to find patterns. That is, to generalize. And here, of course, I'm running up against a huge paradox, because I would consider it my duty to find patterns in, and that is to generalize about creativity. To say non-trivial, to make non-trivial generalizations about creativity. I think that's a tall order. As a matter of fact, I think it's too tall an order. So I will not do it. I will try to do it. I think the best I can do is say a few things about the conditions that may contribute, say felicity conditions, that may contribute to the to creativity. And I'll be using the blending model by Fauconnier and Turner as a launching pad, and I'll be presenting a few case studies from two genres. I agree with Michael Toulon that it's very awkward to talk about the intentions that the goals or the problems that artists try to resolve, although you could make a case for that, but it's very tricky. So I choose to focus on simpler genres where problem solving is a more natural thing to do, namely advertising and comics. Okay, first a very brief introduction to those of you who are not familiar with Fauconnier and Turner's blending theory. They say that two or more phenomena, which they call input spaces, share features or structure, preferably not just features but relations between these features, that is structure, representable in the generic space. And the input spaces are then merged in a so-called blended space, which, one, optimally retains common features and structure from both of the input spaces, and secondly, inherits as much of the input space's unique features as possible. Well, this sounds, and the result is emergent structure, which may be creative. Well, I'm sure this sounds rather daunting, but I'll give you an example. This is the eternally used, very famous within blending theory circles model that Fauconnier and Turner present, right? We have input space 1, input space 2. They have certain things in common. There's the horizontal lines between them. These are the features they share, which of course can be represented formally in the generic space, and are also bestowed onto the blend, but apart from what they have in common, they impose, they bestow unique features, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense to blend them, right? It would be a kind of tautology. Okay, so here's an example. There is a generic space prime mel. In one input space, one could put Noam Chomsky. In the other one, a communicating chimp. And then the blend, it's not mine, it's from Fauconnier and Turner's, would be Nim Chimsky. Right? Here's another example, again from Fauconnier and Turner. In the generic space, there would be vehicle. In one input space, there's car. In the other input space, there would be big boat. And then the blend would be land yacht. Of course, this is reverse engineering, right? We start basically with land yacht and with Nim Chimsky, and then construe which are the two input spaces, or even more than two input spaces, and which is the generic space. Well, I think this at least gives a launching pad to be able to talk about creativity. Tony Veal, Kurt Wyatt, and myself wrote a paper which has not yet been published, in which we tried to use blending theory as a model for creativity. And I auto-quote here the mechanism by which the contents of a second input space are inferred to complement the contents of the first input space is the mechanism that will make blending theory a true theory of creativity. The problem is that Fauconnier and Turner say, well, we present a model for theory, for creativity, but it's always, of course, it's always reverse engineering. You can always, looking back on having a creative blend such as Nim Chimsky, you can show how it came about. But that is something different from saying, okay, we have a model of creativity. So to achieve that, you would have to be able to say something about what happens in the second input space. And here's another quote, and that is, creative duality is concise duality in which a plurality of meanings or functions is achieved not by simple addition, but by fusion and compression. And of course, the Nim Chimsky is a wonderful example of the fusion there, and it is certainly concise duality. You recognize both the input spaces, and it has been conflated in an optimally salient manner. Okay, now I'm no longer purely into language, but I'm into pictures and multimodal discourse, so my examples are always have a pictorial component. So here's my first case study. The creative use of metaphors in advertising. I've been working on metaphors, or multimodal and pictorial metaphors, for a very long time. So some of these are old examples, but I've now given it a different angle. So what is the advertiser's task to make a creative pictorial or multimodal metaphor? And Fauconnier and Turner would agree that a metaphor is a type of blend. So we'll not go into the niceties of their relation. Let's say, okay, metaphor is kind of blend. Well, what would be the task, right? The self-imposed task to create a good advertisement, a good metaphor in advertising, which of course is a nice genre because the goal is clear, and I think Chris Camlin, among other speakers, said yesterday, we always need to keep in focus. What's the use of it? What do you do it for? I mean, if you don't do that, you cannot even start analyzing it. So the self-imposed task is develop a creative representation of a semantic domain, a source domain or an input space that succinctly and surprisingly or humorously or both cues pertinent properties and or structures that can be mapped onto the product promoted, which is the target domain. Okay, again, this one sounds daunting, I'm sure, but here is, so I'll give it a few examples later on.